Hello, this is Conversations with Marsha. It's ongoing discussions with interesting people on issues of education and learning, sponsored by the Great Connections. Great Connections is an educational organization dedicated to reason, individualism, and freedom, and helping young people become more independent and self-confident. Visit our website at thegreatconnections.org. Today, we're talking to Francisco Villalobos, who is a philosophy instructor and strength coach for baby boomers in New York City. His website is Inner Strength Fitness, and we'll put information about that on the notes. But today, we want to talk about how to have agreeable conversations with people who tend to be disagreeable. And Francisco and I and other people have been running into this quite a bit lately, at least from what I've seen in the reporting. So Francisco, what have you noticed that's going on in conversations?
Well, I notice a lot of people, this just happened yesterday with my father. And there you have to be careful because, you're dealing with a parent and they tend to always see you as a child to some extent. But, I wasn't trying to win an argument, but I was trying to respond to his point that there's a conspiracy to keep Trump from winning this election.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to focus on what facts were giving rise to his beliefs about that. I tried to point out that in many of the jurisdictions, the votes that might flip would not make a difference as far as the elections and electoral college were concerned. But I could see him becoming increasingly more agitated as the conversation went on. And so I think at one point he just said, look, let's leave it there. And, he ended the conversation, but he still seemed quite agitated. And I really couldn't reach him. I think he probably felt like I was just mouthing off mainstream media talking points.
Or maybe he justified it as that, but
yeah,
he felt like you weren't empathizing with his point of view and
right,
appreciating what he thought was going on.
right.
So and this seems to happen a lot. I mean, I hear about this happening in families a lot. And
Indeed.
some families are getting divided because of it. Fortunately, it sounds like your dad had the good sense to just leave it off, so you didn't have a total break. But
Right.
what do you think was going on with him that made it hard for you to get through on the ideas and the facts?
I think that having been someone who worked in Marine Corps Special Forces, someone who worked in naval intelligence, he understands perhaps better than I and better than most civilians how exactly the United States has been involved in undermining elections throughout the world, going as far back as 1953 and how we tried to undermine the regime under Mossadegh, the prime minister, and reinstalled the Shah.
Oh,
That was Iran.
Iran. Okay.
And then that was, of course, before my dad's service, but we did similar things in South America and Central America, Nicaragua, Chile, with Pinochet. And so for him, the idea of a kind of silent clandestine force behind the political forces that we see every day, the parties, the various parts of the government, is very real. He sees that there's a clandestine arm of the government that we rarely see. He knows how it can work when we're trying to undermine the political process in another country. And so he jumps from the idea that we did do this, that we can do this, to the fact that we, in fact, did do it this election. And so I was trying to understand, what facts about this election, about what happened in Philadelphia or in any of the other jurisdictions, Atlanta, would lead him to think that there was sufficient manipulation to flip the election for Biden's side. And all he kept going back to was like, well, we've done this before, and I know we can do it. And so it wouldn't surprise me if this is how the deep state is acting in this particular instance. Unfortunately, because there's no evidence, because there's no particular process or facts that he can point to, it's not something that I can argue against or even agree with.
So how do we make a conversation like that better?
Well, I think one of the ways that I made it better for me, I think in time it'll make it better for him when we resume the conversation, and inevitably we will, because he won't let it go, is I try to understand where he's coming from, what's feeding his outlook on things and how things naturally work in government. But I also have to be very clear about what my purpose is in the conversation. So I don't enter the argument with the idea of like, oh, I have to win this argument, or I have to win this debate. There, the object was to just purely understand where he's coming from and to air out facts that don't seem to jive in my own mind with what he's saying, to see how his outlook would respond to that. So, I mean, that's part of it is coming to a conversation with an idea of what your purpose is in the conversation. Sometimes your purpose, if you're a prosecutor, a defense attorney, if you're arguing in front of the Supreme Court, if you're in a debate competition, your purpose is to win and to try to persuade, to win the day and persuade people to go in your direction. But here, my purpose was just understand where my dad's coming from, understand how he sees facts that I think are troublesome for his worldview, and that's enough. So what helps me in those conversations like that with my dad, is just to define my purpose more clearly. It's not always to win polemically. It's just first to understand. So even if I had wanted to persuade him, I'd still have that purpose, at least initially. But in this case, there's no winning when there aren't facts marshaled on both sides, or clear arguments are marshaled on both sides. Just to say that the government has done this before, and look at the various commissions that looked at inappropriate CIA activities back in the 70s, is not evidence that something undermined this particular election. That has to be argued for in its own right.
So you think that in a lot of conversations where people that are close, like family members or friends, get into acrimonious arguments, it's because they're not keeping, they're probably confused about what their purpose is, and maybe they're emotionally involved, and then they want to win the argument. What do you think is going on in many cases?
Yeah, in many cases, I think the idea is to win out over the family member and maybe genuflect a little bit about, how much you know and how intelligent you are and how informed you are. That's usually not a winning strategy at a dinner table. Part of it is to make your point and whatever's coming from your family member or a friend that's been invited to dinner, it's just you're waiting for that silence just so you can continue talking about your points. And
You're not really listening to the other person.
Right,
Waiting to
precisely.
yeah.
Precisely. And so the other person never gets a sense that you're responding to what it is that they're saying. And oftentimes these dinner conversations uh, involve just talking right past each other.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you clearly, don't think that that Trump is a racist, and but he said this, and then you respond by saying something Biden did or Obama said during his presidency, and you never really join each other in a process of first understanding, and then if you want to go there, like what the facts support, one way or the other. So it's usually just talking past each other where it leads to higher and higher levels of anger and frustration, as one would naturally expect when you feel like you're not being heard, you're not being listened to. And sometimes, it's just okay to say, look, the only reason I'm responding here is because I want to register that I disagree. I'm not really on top of all the facts. I don't seem perhaps to be as into it as you, but that just, it doesn't pass my initial smell test, or something seems odd there in the point that you made. And maybe I need to look into it further, but just for now, I want to register that I disagree. Because sometimes just sitting there and taking in what somebody else is saying silently can be seen as conferring assent to what they're saying. So, you don't want to be misconstrued that you're just going along with whatever musings somebody's putting out there.
So it sounds, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that it sounds like a lot of what goes on is that people have some deep personal value that they've invested in some point of view, or they want to protect some value. And in the end, their ego is involved in whether they're right or not about their point of view. So all of that works together to ratchet up the conflict in the conversation when you disagree, and especially if you're not listening to the other person and you're not trying to respond to exactly what the other person is saying. Also, there's this aspect of responding the way in which you respond, wouldn't you say, where if you respond with but, or all you do is you knock what the other person is saying down and then offer your own view instead, they also don't feel heard. It seems more like it's more productive if you acknowledge that, well, there might be some truth in what they have to say, and or try to come up with some way in which what they have to say makes sense, so that then their ego is in a position where they'll feel more likely to listen to you. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. It actually brings up a conversation I had with my sister-in-law. And it's funny because she came to me telling me, I can't talk about this. I can't talk about politics with my sister, meaning my wife. And I said, well, why not? She's like, well, it just, she just shuts me down. And so I just listened to her, and boy, did she open up, about, well, why she thinks this way. And I was like, oh, okay, I see that. I think part of the way I diffused the frustration she came into the conversation with me is to say, look, this has been a very trying time, not just specifically the pandemic that we're going through now, but
Mhm.
these last 4 years have indicated that this country may be taking certain turns, going through certain developments politically that are worrisome. And it's important that we can discuss these things without acrimony, without losing sight of what we already know about each other. And I'm speaking here, of course, to my sister-in-law, who I've known for 11 years now. So it was easy for me to say to her, look, I know your heart, you know mine. You know I'm not a racist. I know you're not a racist.
Mhm.
So let's not lose sight of those things when
Mhm.
we're talking about whether or not there is such a thing as systemic racism, or whether or not
Mhm.
this particular YouTube video illustrates,
Mhm.
clear, unmitigated racism on the part of this police officer or not, or if this particular tweet from the president is indicative of racism.
Mhm.
We can discuss those things and not call into question
Mhm.
our respective characters, our
Mhm.
respective emotional commitments to what is right.
Mhm.
And I think the only difference that I would make when it comes to trying the same thing with somebody who's relatively a stranger to me is that I would just try to bring uh, benevolence, the benevolence of giving someone the benefit of the doubt
Mhm.
about how reasonable they are there. That obviously I can't know their heart the way I know my sister-in-law's,
Mhm.
but I can presume that the person is not ill-intended, is not a crackpot until proven otherwise.
Mhm.
And when I find out that someone has arrived at something just based on a random Facebook post or tweet, uh, or something that they heard on some podcast somewhere, and that there's no evidence there,
Mhm.
if it's worth my time, I might say, look, I disagree with that. It just doesn't jive with this or that. But um, at that point, I might say to myself, I can't reason this person out of a position that they didn't rationally get into. They
Mhm.
didn't acquire it through a rational process. So
Mhm.
they might have acquired it through something, or just, gosh, that fits with my worldview. That fits with my view of how government is, or how politicians are, or how old white men are. And so in that situation, again, I go back to the earlier point about what's my purpose. It's, once I understand that's the fact, is it worth my time to argue with a person? Do I just simply want to understand?
Mhm.
Do I simply want to register that I disagree and move on? That may be it. So you make different levels of effort for, based on different levels of investment you want to make in a relationship and in understanding another person.
Do you think there are some conversations you just should entirely avoid? I mean, can you assess early on in the interchange whether it's just not worth it to talk to the other person about this a given topic?
That's rare for me. I really like engaging with other people intellectually, and I find it very easy to give other people the benefit of the doubt. Just complete strangers on the subway sometimes. But sometimes I've even had a profitable conversation with somebody who's clearly mentally ill.
Mm.
And I just want to understand, how it is they're constructing the uh, the phobias that
Mm.
they're clearly dealing with at the time.
Mm.
Um, but I can imagine. I remember a conversation I had, gosh, many years back in college, where someone early on just came out and said, I just want you to know, I don't feel like I have to prove or give evidence for what I say. I just,
Mm.
I think reason is overrated. I said, well, thank you for being so frank. I think I'm going to work the rest of the room and meet some other people
Right,
and
right,
perhaps get something
exactly.
from the bar. And thank you. It was, thank you for just being so forthright.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Saved me a lot of time because
Yeah.
some people claim to be quite rational and reasonable when in fact they're not.
Yeah.
So I thought that person saved me a lot of time. Very kind.
Yeah. Yes. And the other ones that you're talking about who aren't really reasonable, but pretend to be, or put up uh, they seem to talk as if they're going to be reasonable. Sometimes they can be hard to suss out, are they somebody worth talking to or not?
Yes, agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. That just I think you just have to approach people with um, as much openness as you can bring to the situation, um, and then just let the person present their view. Uh, I find it. I find that another thing that's quite disarming is when you go out of your way to steel man what a person is saying, as opposed to straw manning what they
Mm.
say. It
What do you
relates to
mean
a
by
point
that?
that you made earlier about like, oh, you're constantly finding fault in every little sentence and the way they parsed it. And they're like, well, you obviously can't be talking about everybody.
Mm-hmm.
In an argument, in a discussion, a lively discussion that's extemporaneous, people are going to misspeak. They're going to use always when they mean some.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you show benevolence in terms of how you are reconstructing for them what you hear them saying,
Mm-hmm.
they're like, this guy or woman is interested in sort of dealing with me reasonably and making me sound
Mm-hmm.
perhaps more reasonable than I am right
Mm-hmm.
now with the number of
Yeah.
drinks I've had, or just with my comfort level in this discussion. Perhaps they're not, very good at thinking on their feet.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say, well, look, what I hear you saying is this, is that right? And you do it in a way that makes their point of view constructs it as strongly as it possibly could be constructed.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, that person, it buys a lot of goodwill from
Mm-hmm.
that person because you're showing goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
You're showing that, like, okay, look, I know we sometimes misspeak, we sometimes exaggerate
Mm-hmm.
um, something that we feel passionate about. We might hyperbolize our point a little bit. So you tone it down for them. They're like, yeah, that's what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can respond to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, what does it serve you as a person involved in a heated conversation or argument to straw man someone's point? Or you just want to beat straw men? Do you want to feel, I don't know, educationally or intellectually superior?
Mm-hmm.
Genuflect about your educational attainments and your vocabulary and your ability to speak well extemporaneously. That's all second-handed, um, mishmash as far as I'm concerned. It's just ultimately, if I decide to engage with somebody, I want to make a genuine connection to what it is that they're saying. I want to
So,
make a
so,
genuine connection to them, potentially.
so part of what I hear you saying is that when you're in a conversation with somebody else, make sure you keep your own ego in check. Be aware of how you might be engaging in a way to make yourself feel superior or to prove a point or to defend a value rather than understanding what the other person is saying before you and reflecting that to them in a way that they feel heard before you go on to do any kind of criticism.
Yes, I think the only thing that I would say slightly differently from the way that you put it is that I want to keep my false ego in check. I don't want to feel like I need to perform for someone else or show off how smart I am or educated I am, or how many big words, big $5 words as my dad calls them, I know. Um, I know what these facts are for me,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't gain anything from showing off to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
My genuine ego is fed
Mm-hmm.
by building genuine connections with other human beings, uh, understanding where they're coming from, so that if it somehow conflicts with my worldview or with how I understand something, steel manning what they're saying allows me to understand what kinks there may be in my worldview or in my commitments, or at the very least, then it allows me to better understand how to defend my point of view and my worldview, and genuinely defend it. So it's just, there's some people that have, I think, a false sense of ego, a false sense of what their actual psychological needs are vis-a-vis conversations and arguments with others.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our genuine ego is served by genuinely listening to someone else,
Mm-hmm.
steel manning arguments, identifying our purpose in such conversations, and ultimately, if we're going to look at it from a meta level view, being focused more on being a truth seeker than someone who wins polemical battles.
So you're saying that those things that actually strengthen your real sense of self-worth is seeking the truth, and that these other ways of trying to feel important are not really very they're a fragile and unproductive way to do it. And by steel manning, you mean when you instead straw manning is when you just go after the other person's argument and every little detail of it to try to knock it down and not try to understand it. Steel manning is when you deeply try to understand the other person's argument and properly, well articulate it so that then you both can have a good discussion about what the argument actually is. Is that what you mean?
Yes, that's part of steel manning. I think the other part that's very important is how you construct what it is they're saying, how you sort of repeat it to them, like, okay, this is what I understand you're saying, in a way that makes it, if possible, even stronger than what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone says, like, well, all Americans are this, or it's clearly they're not talking, that they haven't had experience with interacting with 330 million Americans,
Mm-hmm.
nor have they, sort of done an actual scientific sample. They're expressing how they feel Americans generally are. Let's say in terms of how we behave when we travel, our knowledge of other cultures or lack thereof, our knowledge of other languages and customs. And so instead of getting into a battle of like, well, clearly, you haven't met all Americans, or clearly you can't be saying something so foolish as to say like, every single American that's ever visited Europe, or every single New Yorker is rude. You construct what they're saying as strongly as possible, and then you address that point.
Mhm.
Um,
So how would you do it in the
that
case of the 33, all Americans?
right. I think there you'd say, like, I've met many an American that really doesn't care to understand other cultures. I think there are some individuals that don't sort of share your curiosity or mine about those cultures, or doesn't uh, exhibit the same kind of conscientiousness that I think you're trying to communicate about yourself. Um, but I've met a lot of Americans that are quite the contrary. Um, you're an American. I'm talking to you, and you seem to be quite aware of these issues. Um, but what is it? What kind of behaviors have you witnessed that set you off here? And then we might actually end up agreeing. Yeah, some
Yeah.
individuals do act abhorrently when they're in somebody else's culture, somebody else's country, and that's a shame. But it's just, you can make the other person feel that they communicated themselves more powerfully, more intelligently, more cogently than perhaps they did.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an essential part of steel manning.
Mm-hmm.
It's constructing what they say as strongly, as positively as possible, and then dealing with that. Straw manning is not only just picking apart every little thing that a person says and every little qualifier that they use, but trying to paint their arguments to be as weak as possible. And most people, when they receive that kind of treatment, feel like, oh, you're making me sound like an idiot. And it could be that that's in fact based on what actually came out of their mouth. That's what actually they said. But to actually think, oh, that's not what I said. That or at least that's not what I meant. Um, then you get into an argument of like, oh, well, no, but that's what you said. You use this word. You said, yeah, but that's not what I meant. Only an idiot would say something like that.
Yeah.
Well, then I guess you're an idiot.
Yeah.
The village called. They want their idiot back. I mean, where does the conversation go?
Go from there.
That point.
Right.
Now the person feels insulted. They feel put upon. They feel like you're browbeating them. If you genuinely didn't want to have a conversation with someone, if you genuinely didn't want to make a potential connection, it's okay to say, like, I want to meet as many people tonight as possible. I want to go have another drink.
Yeah. Right.
It's okay. You don't have to pretend.
Right.
But it's just when someone feels like you're working hard to make them sound as cogent as possible, that buys you a lot of goodwill on their part. Because in effect, you're showing them benevolence. And I think most people, when they encounter benevolence, they want to respond similarly.
Well, do you have any books or websites or anything you could recommend for people to help them learn how to speak in this more productive way when they have discussions with other people?
Well, I know that a lot of what I've learned about how to speak well with people in what I consider to be crucial conversations, but nevertheless difficult conversations, I learned through the psychologist that you turned me on to many years ago, Carl Rogers. And this was someone who, gosh, at the time I thought, how could he have such productive conversations with people in therapy who are perhaps criminals or explicitly dishonest, even though that never made sense to me why somebody would be dishonest in therapy.
Yeah.
But he found a way to reach the people that he had conversations with, professional and otherwise, by trying to focus on understanding where they're coming from, trying to, as I mentioned before, reconstruct what it is they're saying as positively as possible. So Carl Rogers.
Particular books or what?
Oh, I think it was the book that most influenced me was just, I think it was called The Carl Rogers Reader. And it was just a compendium of a lot of essays and articles that he wrote.
And then
Another one, I'm sorry.
let me ask you, and did you also watch some of the videos of him talking to people? Is that?
Yes. Yes. That I'm glad you brought that up, because this was many years ago that you told me about Rogers. And, I came out of a difficult set of circumstances as a teenager when it came to relations with my stepfather and so forth, and other disagreeable sorts in my childhood. And I have to say that even before the mind understands the principles in how Rogers communicated with people, even before I understood the points he was making in his essays and articles, I took such inspiration from just seeing how he comported himself. The example of that man's desire to know, desire to understand, benevolence, goodwill, those were powerful. And still to this day, I carry that into difficult conversations that still have to be had, because they're crucial, because you want to maintain a good relationship with somebody, a family member, let's say. And I think to myself of his example, and I try to be that example in the difficult conversation. I try to model the benevolence and comportment that I want my interlocutor to respond with.
So both the book and the videos are helpful. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yeah. One other source that I think I would refer to is another, I think, book that you turned me on to, How to Speak So Your Children Will Listen. How to Listen So Your Children Will Speak. Now, this is a book that's intended to help parents talk to their children, but I find the principles of communication in there applicable to conversations between adults. Just a lot, and it's explained like a series of cartoons and scenarios and what have you. And I find it extremely helpful, just as a shorthand to refer to and say, okay, this is what I want to get out of this conversation, and this is how I'm going to approach it.
So that's the book, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen, and Listen So Kids Will Talk.
Kids Will Talk.
And those were students of a psychologist named Haim Ginott, who was a student of Carl Rogers.
That's right.
So it's all connected. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a tradition, I think, and it's it certainly taught me a lot about how I like to approach conversations. I think for a lot of people nowadays, they think like it's enough to say, well, you just have to be stoical and you have to be detached from any particular outcome and detached from what it is that a person's saying. Your father or your mother or your sister can't make you feel some way unless you allow yourself to feel that way. That's not the way I approach things in life. I see some value, I guess, in stoicism for first responders and soldiers, police officers, but I don't experience much gain from thinking that the way to approach difficult but crucial conversations or arguments is to model detachment emotionally.
Mm.
I want to let the person know I care deeply about the outcome of this conversation, or I care deeply, even if it's not about the outcome of the conversation. I care deeply about these issues that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm passionate about it. It's not that I'm detached or I don't care one way or the other. Even just generally to say I'm passionate about the truth and about knowing what the facts are.
Mm-hmm.
You can't feel that way about every single issue. I don't feel that way about string theory, but when it comes to talking about politics or things that might affect my personal relationships, a disagreement I'm having with my wife, it helps to know as you're having this conversation to inform yourself about the attachment that you have to an outcome and to this person that you're talking to, as opposed to detachment, a stoical detachment. I want to think rather, this is someone that I love. How do I want this conversation to come to an end?
Mm-hmm.
I want it to come to a point where we understand each other better.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we continue to agree to disagree, it just I want her to genuinely understand where I'm coming from, and I want to do the same for her.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I want to provide that even for strangers if I decide to engage in a conversation with someone as a stranger. So it's to me, it's about attachment to what is truly valuable.
Mm-hmm.
What truly feeds my genuine ego.
Mm-hmm. So I don't want to keep you too long. I know your time is valuable. I wanted to check whether there was any other point that you wanted to make about this topic before we got off.
Let me see. I think before, when I made the point about appreciate what it takes, if your goal is going to be not just understanding the other person, but trying to persuade the other person, and understanding the steps that a human mind has to take to go from point A to point B to a view that may be incompatible, may do violence to deeply held beliefs or worldviews. I think it helps always to bring a great deal of empathy to that interaction. And that empathy arises from introspection, I think, from self-understanding. Think for yourself. Would you have any regard for yourself? Would you have any core, any spine intellectually if you just flipped on a dime when somebody said, "Oh, well, I read this on Facebook," or Tucker Carlson said this, and and you're like, "Oh, really? Okay, I'm on board with that." We want to feel that we have a certain set of commitments about things that are important to us, and we know in ourselves that we're not going to, unless we're not passionate about any particular thing, that we're not going to abandon those commitments easily, unless we're deluged with a bunch of facts that we have to reconcile with, and then we think about it more, and weeks go by or months go by, and we read stuff about it, and we're like, "Oh, okay, gosh, I didn't really know this as well," or "This person's really opened up my mind to how I can qualify my worldview in this one, in order to incorporate more of what's true." If you understand that about yourself, then you need to appreciate the same epistemic requirements in another person's mind. I think Stephen F. Roberts, an atheist, said, when you can understand why you've rejected all other gods, you'll understand why I reject yours.
Mm.
I think so. If most people can understand and appreciate why most of us now reject Zeus
Mhm.
and Poseidon and Osiris and Baal, you'll understand why there are some people out there that are children of one lesser god and that have no deities to commit to.
Mhm.
And similarly, I think when you understand what it takes for your mind to change on anything that's at all important, you understand that other minds
Mhm.
have to go through similar steps,
Mhm.
sometimes taking months or years
Mhm.
before they change something that they're powerfully committed to.
Mhm. Great, great. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and for your wisdom about how to productively talk to other people. And once again, this is The Great Connections. I'll see you all next time.